give you just a little bit of Spirit of Joy history, just a little bit. How many of you remember Hugging Hilda? Hugging Hilda. I used to tell people when I first came to Spirit of Joy, actually, when anybody walked into Spirit of Joy, the first time they came in or the 100th time they came in, they would get a hug from Hilda. And I like to tell people that she largely set some of the culture for this place. This church couldn't not be a family that loved each other, because if you didn't like hugs, you wouldn't have come back. Well, my very first or second week that I was a pastor here at Spirit of Joy 15 years ago, I was preaching, and I gave an illustration based on Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And it was just that much of my sermon. But I said, and I started the verse, I said, "For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. There is a time to be born and a time to die." And in my second service here in the church, Hilda raised her hand and said, "How come there's a time to die?" That's a scary thing for a pastor when you're new to a congregation. I think my response was something like, I think I said, "Why don't you come talk to me afterwards about that?" But let me continue on with what I was saying. Now, how many of you think that you would have a good answer for that? Why is there a time to die? You got the answer? That's one of those hard passages, isn't it? Why is there a time to die? Well, let me give you a couple of potential answers. First of all, there are 14 pairs of words, and I couldn't quite fit them all on here, so I fit some of the main ones on here. There are 14 pairs of words that are juxtaposed to each other. And some of them are really positive and joyful. Some of them, not so good. And we get to the point, and there's almost an oppressiveness to this. You know, if you think of this, there's a time for this and a time for that. There's a time for this and a time for that. And Solomon, who wrote this, almost had this, it's almost too realistic in some ways. It's almost pessimistic. When Solomon was writing in the first chapter, he was essentially saying, I have tried to do life in every way possible without God. And he says, but yet it's meaningless. In fact, that's how he starts. Meaningless, meaningless. All is ultimately meaningless. He says things like, the sun rises and the sun sets. The rain comes down, the rivers all flow into the sea, but the sea is never full. The wind blows to the east and then to the west and back again. All things are wearisome. And there's a sadness and almost a pessimistic sense to what Solomon writes. He says in the beginning of chapter 2, he said, so I made a test. And he started making tests of all kinds of things in chapter 2. I made a test of pleasure. I went out, richest man in history, I went out and did everything that I wanted. And at the end, it didn't bring me any satisfaction. And here he comes to Ecclesiastes in 3rd chapter, and he says, there's a time for this and a time for that. Time for this and a time for that. We get some good, we get some bad. And there's almost this oppressive rhythm that comes in the midst of all of this. And he's realistic, but he's also maybe a little pessimistic in the way that he writes. And you can look at the positive ones. There's a time for peace and for love and for seeking and embracing, for dancing and building up and healing. But there's also a time, is there, for war and for hate? For tearing and losing and mourning and weeping and tearing down and killing, uprooting and dying? Now, are all of those things part of life? Has everyone experienced pretty much all of those? This is a realistic picture of what life is like. But it's kind of depressing, isn't it? There's some good, but there's also some bad. I mean, we have some wonderful things like there are times to dance. I loved, for example, my niece got married this year, and my little 2.5-year-old granddaughter at the time danced for an hour and a half, just without stopping. There's a time to dance, and it's beautiful. But is it always appropriate? Is it appropriate to dance at places to mourn like funerals? All of us love things like there's a time to heal. But are we happy with the fact that maybe there are times to stand up in the midst of war and fight against evil? True evil? I mean, most of our wars nowadays are a whole lot more complicated than true good versus true evil. But is there ever a time to kill? These are complicated passages in the midst of all of this. But let's take this from the other side. How many of you have ever sewn anything from a tapestry to a cross stitch? The front is beautiful, right? But is the back sometimes kind of messy? Yeah. Sometimes we don't always see things from the front side. We only see them from the back. And there's God's perspective in all of these things. He says, there are times for peace and for love, for sowing and seeking and embracing and building up. And maybe from God's perspective, how we live our lives in this messy world matters. Maybe the right action at the right time allows us to experience God's purposes rather than our own selfish ideals. Maybe we don't have the full picture at any given moment, and we have to learn to trust God, that He is weaving something more beautiful than we can imagine. Let me tell you just a story or two. Remember Esther? There's a book in the Bible about Esther. In the simplest way possible, Esther was a Jewish exile. She was in the land of a very crass king. The queen stood up to the king, and so the queen was fired. And so, crass king, do you know how he chose his next queen? Beauty contest. All right? Esther, a Jewish exile, actually won the beauty contest. And so, she's living now in the palace. But Haman, the evil Haman, if you've ever been to a Jewish Purim service, whenever they read this story, they read the whole book that night. And they do it as a melodrama. Whenever they mention Haman, everybody boos. Boo, Haman. Because Haman was systematically planning to exterminate the Jews. But Mordecai, Esther's uncle, found out. And so what did Mordecai do? He goes to Esther. Now, he says, you need to speak. And Esther's like, remember what happened to the last queen? I don't think I want to do that. But Mordecai says to her, who knows, Esther? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for just such a time as this. Isn't that beautiful? maybe all you see is the messy side of the tapestry, but there is a beauty that is waiting. Let me tell you another story. Anybody remember the story of Corrie ten Boom? Corrie ten Boom and her father and her sister were Dutch watchmakers. And then the Nazis rolled in. They heroically hid Jews in their home so they wouldn't be captured and put to death. They were eventually thought to be, they never found the Jews that were hiding there, but they were thought to be allied with the underground, which they were. They were captured, they went into prison camps. Her father and her sister died. Corrie, who would tell you, I was the one with the least faith of the lot, was left to write the story. Now, it was a horrific story. The prison camps were awful. But the gift that God gave Corrie was being able to see the other side of that tapestry. In fact, she wrote these words, "My life is but a weaving between my God and me. I cannot choose the colors. He weaveth steadily. Ofttimes he weaveth sorrow, and I in foolish pride forget he sees the upper, and I the underside. Not till the loom is silent, and the shuttles cease to fly, will God unroll the canvas and reveal the reason why. The dark threads are as needful in the weaver's skillful hand as the threads of gold and silver in the pattern he has planned." Isn't that beautiful? To be able to see on the other side of the Holocaust the beauty in life. For who knows? Perhaps, Esther, you have come to your royal position for just such a time as this. And perhaps you have come to the kingdom. That's another translation. For just such a time as this. And we could look around and we could say, Randy, perhaps you've come to the kingdom for just such a time as this. And Joyce, perhaps you have come to the kingdom for just such a time as this. And Mark, perhaps you have come to the kingdom for just such a time as this. And Jillian, perhaps you have come to the kingdom for just such a time as this. Have you ever stopped and think that God could have put you anywhere in history? Anywhere, anytime. And yet, He chose you for just this time. How many of you have ever looked back and said, I remember the good old days, things aren't going as well now? You ever thought that? How many of you have ever thought, I would have liked to have lived back then instead of living now? But perhaps you specifically have come to the kingdom for just such a time as this. Did you ever stop and think about that? That God has placed you here for a reason, that there is a purpose for your life here and now and in the midst of each day. We're coming up on a new decade. Can anybody here believe truly that it's already 2020? Yeah. Now, in terms of optometry, our optometrists are not here today, but in terms of optometry, is 2020 a good thing? Yes. 2020 is a very good thing. It is seeing clearly. And our goal today is to look at God's time for each of us and maybe try and see a little bit more clearly. Now, I want to help you do this a little bit. How many of you, I asked somebody on the way in, how was your Christmas? And they said, it was absolutely wonderful. And they said, the music was incredible. It helped me worship God. And did you know what? For 3 days, there was no politics whatsoever. Right? Wasn't that beautiful? I found an article from a guy named Matt Ridley at The Spectator who says, and see if you agree with this or disagree, we've just had the best decade in human history. Seriously. Right? How many of you would agree with that? Well, let me read you what he said. He said, let nobody tell you that the second decade of the 21st century has been a bad time. We are living through the greatest improvement in human living standards in history. Extreme poverty has fallen below 10% of the world's population for the first time ever. He says it was 60% when I was born. He's about my age. 50 years ago, the world poverty rate was 60%. And now it's down to 10. We still got a ways to go, right? But it's down to 10. He says global inequality has been plunging as Africa and Asia experience faster economic growth than Europe and North America. Child mortality has fallen to record low levels. Famine virtually went extinct. Malaria, polio, and heart disease are all in decline. Little of this made the news because good news is no news. But I've been watching it all closely. Ever since I wrote The Rational Optimist in 2010, I've been faced with what about questions. What about the Great Recession? What about the Euro crisis? What about Syria, Ukraine, and the Middle East? What about Donald Trump? How can I possibly say that things are getting better given all of that? The answer is because bad things happen while the world still gets better. Yet, get better it does. Perhaps one of the least fashionable predictions I made 9 years ago was that the ecological footprint of human activity is actually shrinking. And we are getting more sustainable, not less. That is to say, our population and economy would grow, but we would learn how to reduce what we've taken from the planet. And nations are beginning to use less stuff. Less metal, less water, less land, not just in proportion to productivity, but less stuff overall. This does not quite fit with the Extinction Rebellion lot are telling us. But as for my native Britain, our consumption of stuff probably peaked around the turn of the century, an achievement that has gone almost entirely unnoticed. Because what if economic growth and innovation means using less stuff, not more? For example, a normal drink can today contains 13 grams of aluminum, much of it recycled. But in 1959, it contained 85 grams. Substituting the former for the latter is a contribution to economic growth and reduces the resources consumed per drink. LED light bulbs consume about a quarter as much electricity as incandescent bulbs. Modern buildings generally contain less steel and more of it recycled. Offices are not yet paperless, but they use much less paper. And instead of owning a camera and a radio and a flashlight and a compass and a calendar and a watch and a CD player and a bunch of maps and a stack of newspapers every single day, I use my one cell phone instead. And efficiencies in agriculture mean the world is now approaching peak farmland. So despite the growing number of people in the world, we use 60% less land to produce a given quantity of food as compared to 15 years ago. Meaning, by 2050, it's estimated that an area the size of India will have been released from farming, with forests expanding. And large animals are returning in abundance in productive countries: wolves, beavers, lynx, eagles, and now even tigers. Efficiencies? In Britain, the UK's economy has almost trebled in size since 1970, and our population is up by 20%. Yet total primary inland energy consumption has actually fallen by almost 10%. Indeed, let nobody tell you that the second decade of the 21st century has been a bad time. Now, did that challenge your thinking a little bit? Yeah. I mean, how many of us have focused on, we are at a place in human history where there is so much division and secularization and politicization, I can't even say it, of every issue that there is. And we are just so divided. Things seem to be getting worse. And yet the things that are getting better get no attention. Now, I don't expect you to look around and say things are perfect. But maybe, perhaps, you were given this life for just such a time as this. Maybe you and I can be healing forces in this world instead of part of the divisiveness. On Christmas Eve, I talked about, boy, if Jesus is the Prince of Peace, where is all the peace that's supposed to be here, right? And so I used one of those passages that talks about the peace of God that passes all understanding. And how many of us yearn for more peace? That peace of God that passes all understanding, do you know where it comes from? It comes in individual lives when we stop and give thanks. And when we pray and connect ourselves to God instead of just this world. It comes when we rejoice and worship. And when we have that peace, it begins to spill out on those around us, starting with our own families. So here we come now to 2020. Matthew 6, Jesus says, "Do not worry about tomorrow. It will have enough worries of its own. There is no need to add to the troubles that each day brings." Now, when I read this, the first thing I do is, and I do this in a lot of my counseling, how many of us spend a lot of our lives looking backward? And we're controlled sometimes by that, aren't we? So if someone, for example, has been abused and there's a negative past, how often is the present clouded by that negative past? Or maybe it's a positive past. We had great times and this nostalgia, but those good times aren't coming around again. You ever been tempted to think that? The good old days are behind me. It's never going to be as good. And so the past can control us. The future can control us also. A negative view of the future we call worry. And that can harm our ability to live today, can't it? But I've even watched people be controlled by a negative, a positive view of the future that controls them bad ways. So, well, it'll be good when I get to do that. It'll be good when I get there. It'll be good. The good is always out there, and we miss the good of today. And so Jesus says, and here's what I hear in this. I hear this sense of just very simply, Don't focus on tomorrow. Don't focus on the past. Focus on today. And there is a Latin term that says this, carpe diem. Anybody heard of carpe diem? What does it mean? Seize the day. Yes, it originally started with Horace. He's the one that actually first that we know of wrote the words. Lived about the time of Jesus. He was a Roman. It was a Greek philosophy as well. Epicurus and the Epicurean philosophy. Jesus, though, I think said most clearly. Essentially, what I hear in these words of Jesus are, seize the day. Today is God's gift to you. And perhaps you were created, placed here for just such a time as this. I want to give you a few kind of carpe diem kind of quotes that I've heard. One is from Mother Teresa. Hey, yesterday's gone. Tomorrow's not yet come. We only have today. So let us begin. Pope John Paul II said, the future starts when? Today, not tomorrow. Emily Dickin once said, forever is composed of a million right nows. Right? Annie Dillard, how we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. So let me ask you something. We are on the verge of a new decade. It is a symbolic beginning starting Wednesday, right? What are you called to in life? Have you stopped and thought about that lately? Or how many of us are just caught up on that hamster wheel and it's just day after day after day after day? And what we're accomplishing is going around in a lot of circles. So what are we called to in life? Actually, the best-selling Christian book ever came out about 15, 20 years ago. It was from Rick Warren. It was The Purpose-Driven Life. He said, I can tell you what your purpose is. I don't even have to have met you because God lays it out clearly. We're called to worship. That's that first thing in life. I remember that person who came in this morning and said, how was Christmas? They said it was wonderful, all of the songs that we sang. Instead of focusing on the world, focused on worship for 3 days. Right? That's what we are called to. We are first called to point out to God. And then discipleship, we are called, invited to learn more about Him. That's what we're going to be doing through all eternity. We're going to be with God throughout all eternity. And we have all eternity to grow in our knowledge of God, who is so vast and loving and multifaceted. That's going to be the greatest joy in our life. We are called to discipleship, of growing our faith. We are called to fellowship, to making not earthly the priorities the center of our life, but our church's family as the center of our lives. We're called to service, of making a difference in the lives of other people. We're called to evangelism. These were some of the best chapters in Rick Warren's book. I remember him telling the story of how passionate his father was as an evangelist. And when he went into his father's deathbed, his dad was coming in and out of consciousness. And all his father was saying was, just one more. Just one more. Let me tell one more person about Jesus. Just one more. Those are our purposes in life. Now, we can add a couple to that. How about family and career? You know one of my favorite stories that I've heard in recent days? Someone came to me and they said, my sister and I had a falling out about 20 years ago. I haven't talked to her in decades. And his heart was grieving. What do I do? I haven't talked to her. I made a suggestion, wasn't original to me. I said, start writing postcards. Why postcards? because they don't even have to open an envelope. They just flip it over. And so the person bought 10 postcards and started writing postcards to his sister. And his greatest gift this Christmas has been they call each other every other day now. So many families are divided. So many hurts are in our lives. There's so much water under the bridge. Maybe is that what we're called to? And how about career? I put a question mark there on purpose because so many of us, if I said, all right, set goals for the next 10 years, how many of us would be tempted to do it professionally? Well, I want to be this, I want to get up to that level. Work can be a gift. God designed us to work, to be purposeful in our lives. Work is a gift in terms of it pays the bills and it makes ends meet. And it's a gift in that sense. We can bless our families just by being people of honor and integrity and working hard, can't we? But it's not all about career. What if we begin to see our lives? Do you know Pastor Conda, 15, 20 years ago, read a book called Halftime. He was at that time about halfway through his career. And the first half of the career is that struggle for significance. Who am I going to be in life? What am I going to accomplish? What can I accumulate? He began to say, what I need to figure out is what I want to do for the second half of my life. And he retired from a very professional job. And he more or less volunteers to serve our church. Isn't that powerful? What are we called to? How do we turn this next decade into significance instead of selfishness? Remember the first words of Rick Warren's book? Anybody know it? It's not about you. I believe that one sentence is what that set that book apart and drove people to focus on it. Because everywhere else, it's all self-help. This one was, it's not about you. It's about worshiping God and serving neighbor. Think about this in terms of work. Luke 12. Jesus told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought, what should I do? I have no place to store all of my crops. Then he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build bigger barns. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. You fool. That's what Solomon realized. The only hope in Ecclesiastes is that at the end, and he said, I chased every kind of pleasure and money and finances and everything, and the only thing that began to make sense of my life was God in my life. Serving Him and serving others. So what are we called to in life? There's two tools that might help. There's physical margin. How many of you know that you'll be more effective if you're actually healthier? We need to create physical margin in our lives so we have the energy to do what we're called to. The second one is financial margin. Okay? You can have margin with that much money. If you budget, if you don't get into debt, if you pay off debt, all those Dave Ramsey things we learned a few years ago. If we control our money instead of it controlling us, then we have the margin to do whatever God calls us to do. So goals for 2020. These are on the back, and I encourage you to go home and take a look at these. This sermon's a little different than many of them. It's more practical. We're beginning a new decade. But think of this first. What do you want to accomplish in 10 years? Did you know that every one of us in this church could be a physician in 10 years if we set our minds to it? You wouldn't want someone like me to be your doctor, but we could do it if we really wanted to. But in 10 years, that's a long time, isn't it? We could accomplish huge things, right? What do you want to accomplish in 10 years? And if that's the first question, the second question is this. Well, if that's what I want to accomplish in 10 years, then this is what I need to accomplish in the next 5 years, right? And the final one is, then what must I accomplish this year? It's that journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, right? We've got to start somewhere. What must I accomplish this year? Can I tell you what mine is real quick? My biggest thing is, probably in 10 to 15 years, I'm going to be retired. All right? Okay? Old pastors never truly retire, but 15 years, I'll probably retire. And you know what? I function best when I'm doing and not sitting. I'm not contemplative. And so I talked to Bill Fleming, he preached a couple weeks ago. Have you met Bill Fleming? His new phase of his career, he just retired, is he's a spiritual director. I want to learn how to sit and be more satisfied. Because what do I do when I become old and don't have that list of to-dos? That's my goal. Until then, I'm going to keep worshiping, discipleship, all of those kinds of things. I'm going to keep serving because that's who I'm called to be. But I want to be able to set myself up for that next season in my life. What do you want to accomplish? Maybe it's as simple as I want reconciliation in my family. And maybe that's something that you can do in 10 years, even if you're beginning to say, I'm elderly. Maybe I want to share faith with those in my family who don't have this gift. That's my goal. What do I need to do to equip myself to do that in a winsome way to win them later? What do you want to accomplish? Just a few more quotes. A man that is young in years may be old in hours if he has lost no time. Don't lose time. Okay? In fact, Malcolm Gladwell is famous for this. He says 10,000 hours is the magic number for greatness. He says, based on studies in elite performance, an extraordinarily consistent answer in an incredible number of fields emerges. You need to have practiced to have apprenticed for 10,000 hours before you get good. I watched my son practice the organ for 10,000 hours. He's really good now. Okay? That's 4.8 years of dedicated practice. All right? But you can do it. You can do what you are called to do. I like this from Charles Richards. Don't be fooled by the calendar. There are only as many days in the year as you make use of. Isn't that interesting? The future depends on what you do today. It's never too late to be what you might have been. There are obviously two educations. One should teach us how to make a living. The other, how to live. When you kill time, remember that it has no resurrection. And from Scripture, sow in righteousness, reap in mercy. Break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord. Dear friends in Christ, it is time to seek the Lord more fully, more wonderfully, more deeply. And that's what will make these next 10 years holy. You know the time, the hour has come for you to wake from sleep. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to the kingdom for just such a time as this. You have come to the kingdom for just such a time as this. So watch carefully how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best of your time. And here's our prayer to end with today. I'm going to let you say this with me. These are verses about time from Scripture. But let us pray. Lord, teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. Time's in your hand, Lord. Make everything beautiful in your time. Let us rise.